Hello. Hello, everybody. All right, so today we're going to talk about, you won't believe it, we're going to talk about why is there something rather than nothing. And, I know your skepticism is probably warranted. What are the chances that I will say anything meaningful that could potentially add to the conversation? And, the truth is the chances are very low. So, hopefully if I say anything whatsoever that isn't completely trivial, hopefully that is itself a high bar to meet. And that's what I'll try to do today. It's a very complex topic. I figure that I'll indulge in a little bit of ginger in the meantime, both of, lemon ginger smell. And I've also got a shot of ginger to carry me through this very complex, this very difficult subject. And the quality of the day is going to be nothing. Now, nothing as in the experience of trying to conceptualize nothing. And I think it's a very significant type of experience. And for the most part, if you ask a grown-up, what do you think about nothing? Nothing itself, like as a concept, as an experience. And for the most part, they will be pretty jaded about it. I think like a lot of people will just not take very seriously that inquiry. But if you ask a kid, that's where you get usually the strong effect sizes, where, they haven't been, in a sense, burned by confusion yet about it. And I do remember as a kid, other kids were pretty receptive to, contemplating the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why isn't there just nothing? Wouldn't it be simpler if just absolutely nothing existed? But even trying to imagine that state is strange brain teaser, or even worse, it's like a brain zapper. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And maybe the fact that it's difficult to conceptualize nothing is a clue that maybe we're just not thinking about it in the right way. And what I'm going to be talking about today, really, it's kind of like I'm really standing on the shoulders of giants here. I mean, like, bringing together, advanced conceptions of math and physics and a lot of philosophy by David Pearce, who basically has a tentative answer to why is there something rather than nothing. And there are some things that are new, that we have been discussing at QRI that I'll be talking about towards the end of the talk that kind of like build on top of everything that has already been said. But, the things that I'm going to present to you even before that, I suspect most people haven't really considered, and hopefully is going to be a genuinely interesting and novel way of approaching this entire, problem space, the problem of existence itself. And let's dig into it. Okay, so first of all I think that the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is a perfectly meaningful, perfectly legitimate question. A lot of people say, it goes out of kind of the logical scheme that an argument can potentially encompass, and it's too tautologically consistent, or is too basic, and they might say things like that to try to dismiss the question. And to a large extent, I think that's kind of a failure of the imagination, and also just being jaded and burnt out, having thought about it and maybe mapped out a little bit possible arguments and ways of thinking about this, but being just frustrated by it. And really, when it comes down to it, the kind of first things that people think about, when you ask the question, why is there something that nothing, is like, okay, yeah, you break it down into, various possibilities. One is, everything has always existed and always will. And in that sense, there's no beginning to explain. What you have to explain is, the existence of everything, including, infinite time, both, let's say in the future and the past, or, if there was a beginning. That's also when it gets like really strange and trippy too, because, how did that, get kick-started? If nothing existed before it, what kind of process made it, all of a sudden kickstarted the evolution of the universe. And, somewhere in here, in fact, I think there is a powerful argument for eternalism, which is a philosophy of time that says that basically directions like, left and right and front and back are more or less equivalent to, before and after. That really there's kind of like, directions in these, maybe four-dimensional manifold or, something more complicated. But the point is that the present is just as real as every other moment in space-time or in the multiverse. And in that sense, you don't really have to explain why it began, because there's nothing ontologically special about the beginning of the universe. The entirety of it is, in a sense, equally mysterious. But it does emphasize that, to some extent, if you want to address the question of why is there something rather than nothing, the language of causality is potentially doomed, because with the language of causality, you're trying to explain why something is the case by explaining what were the, underlying conditions that made it a likely outcome. And more so, given those conditions and given rules for evolving those conditions, you basically want, a combination of rules and pre-existing conditions that make the observables very likely, basic, Bayesian epistemology and so on. And to a large extent, the language of causality and analyzing problems in terms of causality is what our natural thinking process does. That's kind of our habit of thinking. That's usually how we go about explaining, big questions, even like, why did we evolve from, hominids, and why are we, vertebrates as opposed to invertebrates, or, all of these interesting questions. Yeah, they can have answers in the language of causality. And I definitely don't want to dismiss that. But when it comes to the big question, why is there something rather than nothing? In either of the two conditions, okay, like maybe, causal events extend all the way infinitely back, or they start at some point in the past. Either way, the language of causality just doesn't seem to apply to the broader question of why the whole thing exists. So instead of that, I would recommend, maybe as a guiding, North Star, not necessarily the final answer, but rather than to think of it in terms of the language of causality, think of it in terms of the language of implication, logical implication. So like, think more about a mathematical proof, although what we're going to do is actually kind of more general than a mathematical proof. It's some kind of like hyperproof of some sort. Versus, an explanation style that looks at pre-existing conditions and rules that make them evolve, and, probabilities and things like that. So like, that's unlikely to give us much insight here. It's much more likely that, there is some deep fundamental reason why, in some sense, nothingness would imply the existence of us and everything. Okay, so that's an important note to put it out there. I also want to emphasize that some people come up with kind of an attempt of an approach to this problem, which is to say that maybe we don't exist. Consciousness is an illusion to begin with, and reality is an illusion. Now, I don't go that route because I do think moments of experience are real. That's what you are. That is what I am. And I think it's a grave mistake, to actually not, consider consciousness something real, and hopefully with like very regular laws that we can understand and make sense of. But there is something tricky here that is important to address, and that is that consciousness also has models of itself. And those models do generate, for the most part, illusory type representations of what even consciousness is. And in this sense, there are some aspects of experience that are indeed, quite illusory. And it's important to recognize that. And here, definitely, I tend to use as a guide, or at the very least an inspiration, Buddhism and the three characteristics of existence that basically they say, if you don't understand these three characteristics of existence, you will be hopelessly confused and more so be constantly kind of generating suffering by this misconception. Basically, there's going to be this dissonance between what's actually there and what you want it to be there, and what you're expecting there to be, and that is going to generate problems. So these three characteristics are no self, that, there is no impermanent, immutable, metaphysical self that continues to exist over time and is separate than everything else. And we have covered that. I mean, there's a lot of videos in my channel and in QRI and quality computing, and a lot to discuss, personal identity and the illusory nature, at the very least, of, closed individualism. This idea that you start existing when you're born and you stop existing when you die. More likely, in a sense, is that there are these different snapshots of experience, and it's kind of two sides of the same coin. You can either see reality as a collection of snapshots of experience, or you can see it as pure consciousness manifesting in all of these different ways. And in that sense, there might be kind of equivalent in a deep way, but the point to make is that, no self. And if you do believe in a self, you may be closing off a whole explanation space for explaining why is there something rather than nothing. It may actually be difficult to overcome that. The other two are insatisfactoriness, basically that no sensation will ever fully, truly satisfy permanently. There's nothing you can feel that will make everything okay forever. Maybe MDMA will make it feel okay for a while, but it's not going to be forever. And that's important. That there's no true ultimate satisfaction. As soon as there is like information and sensation, whatever satisfaction it delivers is impermanent, and finally is impermanent itself. That's like the third characteristic, that nothing truly fundamentally stays the same. And if you ask a Buddhist monk, they will say that even our the idea that there's kind of this stream of consciousness that is like slowly changing, there's kind of a ship of Theseus type of situation, even that is saying too much. That in reality there is countless, we're talking about perhaps like 1,000 micro-phenomenological blips per second, and that our experience is kind of this jumbled up attempt at snapping together a narrative out of these like micro-phenomenological blips. And I kind of resonate with that. I mean, in the moments of experience view of personal identity called empty individualism, the amount of snapshots of experience that there is in a given second might be, in the order of thousands. There's like lots of little flashes, and it's kind of like a TV with the various frames. And I should emphasize too that each of the frames contains the illusion of the continuity and the illusion of the experience of time. And I have a video about that if you're interested, about time specifically and how it's implemented in consciousness. So, in this sense, yes, if you approach reality with a kind of one of those misconceptions, that either there's something fundamentally and truly permanent over time, or there is a fundamental ontological self, or that things satisfy permanently, I do think, that causes some type of dissonance. It causes kind of these micro-phenomenological contractions that accumulate over time and in the end make you very frustrated. And that's why, meditating and trying to iron out these misconceptions actually benefits your well-being, but also I think the clarity of your thinking about how you make sense of reality. Okay, so let's continue in this path. Okay, so those are kind of misconceptions and issues that we have with how we think about this. But maybe it's the case that nothing is really not a straightforward thing. And the fact that it's difficult for us to imagine nothing is not tautologically the case. It's more like a hint that there's something about reality that is kind of a huge blind spot to our normal state of consciousness, or discursive, logical, causal state of consciousness, or a conscious state of consciousness that looks causal explanations and so on, there's like big blind spots about explanatory styles and possible ontological objects in reality, and that nothing may just be in one of those kind of blind spots. But it may be possible as well to overcome that by basically taking these very seriously and just kind of avoiding the typical tropes, the typical, grooves of thought that we have. And in this sense, basically the medium of thought, basically the quality of your thinking. And I don't mean to say that just in a scale, like, oh, low quality thinking, high quality thinking. No, I mean, in a very rich description, what are the, pictures, either, visual or tactile or auditory or synesthetic or something else that come up when you are trying to model some aspect of reality. And, I'm a big fan of Richard Feynman, because he had a kind of this tremendous introspective ability to recognize that when he was introspecting about, physics, trying to make a model of a particular thing, such as temperature or, chemical valence or something like that, that he needed to find the right pictures in order to fully understand it. And of course, like when you get down to something like quantum mechanics, most of the typical common pictures that people have, such as like waves and particles and forces, which is, kind of like what we see at the macroscopic level, they don't fit the behavior of, the way in which the wave function of quantum mechanics evolves. It just is not just kind of like the paradoxical. I mean, I definitely think it's a mistake to even talk about like wave particle duality and things like that. I think that's there's a misconception. It's also an invitation to a lot of, I think, not very fruitful speculation. I mean, I can just say that, maybe 10% of presentations at the science of consciousness, for example, rely on some kind of confused notion that there is this weird paradox of, particle and wave, and there's that duality here. Whereas, no, it's more that, the evolution of the universal wave function of quantum mechanics has wave-like and particle-like properties, but it's not this paradoxical thing that mixes both. It's like, no, it's actually, the way in which a field is evolving according to the Schrödinger equation, and it has a particular shape. And that shape just happens to, in some circumstances, produce particle-like behavior. Not exactly particle, but particle-like, and wave-like behavior in other circumstances. So in that sense, what I'm calling out here is the importance of recognizing the limitations of your implicit models, of your pictures of reality. And when we talk about why is there something rather than nothing, I think partly the reason why people mentally, shut down, why they turn off their brain and think like, oh, that's unknowable, is because in their library of mental pictures and models, nothing can even approach or touch this question. And that of course makes it very, frustrating. The answer, however, I think is get better pictures, not abandon the quest. Get better pictures. Okay. I have brought this book before. Amusing Ourselves to Death is more relevant today than it has ever been, which is about like how the medium by which information is presented influences basically how truth is constructed. Obviously, right now we're experiencing huge side effects of mass delusions of all sorts because of the way in which the misinformation gets, evolutionarily amplified on the internet. But that's a bit beside the point. This is more general. I mean, it's not only about like, hey, you're going to have like some misinformation problems if you have certain mediums of communication. It's more that the medium of communication will inherently curtail some ways of thinking. And the worst way in which it can do that is to convince you that there's only a few ways of thinking, whereas actually it's a very open space. There's a lot of new ways of thinking that you can come up with if you just set your mind to it. Just going to read a quick quote from here, which is, "My argument is limited to saying that a major new medium changes the structure of discourse." Yeah, so like if we have a new medium, whether it's communication medium or even thought medium, it's going to modify the nature of discourse. It does so by encouraging certain uses of the intellect, by favoring certain definitions of intelligence and wisdom, and by demanding a certain kind of content. In a phrase, by creating a new form of truth-telling. And yeah, so when you think about why is there something rather than nothing, remember that if the frustration bubbles up right away, I think it's because the truth-telling metaphors that we have are just, insufficient to tackle this problem. But you've got to be open-minded. Okay, so let's get on to the answer. The big reveal. Why is there something rather than nothing? According to David Pearce, is this whole idea called Zero Ontology. And this is not to say that nothing is real, which would be kind of a cop-out. Rather is to say we need to enrich our conception of what nothing is, what nothing could be. And one of the interesting kind of judo moves that David Pearce does in his wonderful essays about this is to recognize that you can frame what nothing is in terms of something like information as opposed to, physicality. And he talks about how zero information is in some sense equivalent to all possibilities at once in superposition. And the concrete example here is that if you have a chessboard and somebody tells you, and you know nothing about, the state of the chessboard, and then somebody tells you that, there's a rook in this square over here, that is a lot of information because it rules out a whole set of possible, board positions and configurations. And, you may even infer like some aspects about, what's going on in the game just by knowing that there's a rook over there. But the point is that in this view, information means to rule out possibilities. And that zero information being the case, and that might be, an absolutely necessary aspect of existence, that there is just zero information, that may entail, again, not cause, but entail, implicate the existence of all possibilities in superposition. And now this is a clever idea. It's fun to think about. But for the most part, and rightfully, people will generally dismiss it as, kind of just a fantasy or a cop-out or something like that. They will say, yeah, but I mean, when you look at, matter and energy, there's a lot to explain. That's just not nothing, right? Like if we, basically there's like a lot of pre-existing information in the universe. So like this idea that there's truly no information and that's why, everything exists in superposition doesn't seem to hold up, at least on a superficial analysis. But what makes his theory and his approach in particular so incredibly compelling is that it's actually grounded in physics, math, and phenomenology. So I'm going to explain one at a time. So first of all, math. I mean, it's kind of fascinating. It took a while for people to come up with zero, and it was invented / discovered in several cultures in parallel. So there's kind of, it's almost kind of like a conceptual blocker, but once you come up with zero, mathematically, so many other things open up, from, kind of like positional or like digital, decimal numbers or something like that, all the way up to, category theory reinterpreted in terms of, partialed out zeros. And, that's a rabbit hole right there. But a simple example is just how there's been attempts to basically reconstruct all of arithmetic based on the empty set. That, you can kind of think of a given number as a way of taking the set of the empty set together with, let's say, the empty set. And you kind of recursively can create higher and higher quote unquote numbers that are like fundamentally just different nestings of the empty set. So in that sense, maybe in math, it's kind of true that 0 in math entails the rest of math. One example he also puts in his essay is like if you have like, the number 42, that entails, it implicates the existence of every other number too. You cannot just have 43 or 42. 42 implies 43 and implies 44 and so on. So, in some sense, the existence of any given number is logically equivalent and implicates the existence of every other number and every other possible extension you could produce out of it. So he basically says that, in math, 0, the empty set, entails all of math. And okay. So that's an interesting, perspective. How about physics? Okay, in physics, it's pretty weird. Because this is empirical. This is not, imagined, but as far as it can be measured and looked around in the universe, it does seem to be the case that the total electric charge of the universe is 0. The total energy, once you take into account, potential energy and the energy stored in space-time, the total energy of the universe is 0 as well. The total momentum in the universe, if you add up all of the momentum vectors of all of the entirety of the mass in the universe, it comes out to be 0. In some sense, there's no net momentum. The angular momentum too. And if you look at all of these different state variables and I guess like fundamental properties of physics, a lot of them seem to be fundamentally capable of canceling themselves out in the sense that there is a net 0 amount. Now this may not work for everything. I mean, like there is this huge puzzle in physics of why there is matter, so much matter relative to antimatter, because matter and antimatter, they cancel each other out. And, if you excite the quantum vacuum, you can get all of a sudden, matter and antimatter pairs. But usually they tend to, annihilate each other and create photons, just like constantly, and in that sense, it's really weird that you have so much mass in this universe that is in the form of, matter as opposed to antimatter. And that's a big puzzle, but the sort of solutions that we might expect here is that in some strange way, the antimatter equivalent of the universe is, out there. It exists, not necessarily in a given direction, but it could be, in a different dimension, in a different way of factoring how the entirety of the, multiverse is constructed, such that, maybe we are in kind of the foliation where matter is happening and there's like another foliation where antimatter is happening. We don't know. Okay, so I just want to point out that, okay, matter continues to be a mystery, but the other properties, it's kind of stunning, right? Like net energy, net, electric charge, net momentum, etc. Now, even here though, the similarity with 0 goes way deeper, and this is a huge rabbit hole in physics because you also have basically symmetries underlying preservation laws. And in a sense, symmetries, in some sense, also entail some kind of a canceling out of possibilities. And, there's Noether's theorem about how, any local symmetry entails a global symmetry and so on, like that things are, the laws of physics stay the same over time, entails preservation of energy, just as an example. Or I believe translational symmetry entails, the preservation of momentum and so on. So deep down, in a sense, you could say that these quantities are the manifestations of these more fundamental preservations, these invariances that also fundamentally turn out to be equivalent with 0 in a fundamental sense. But even deeper, I mean, if you look at quantum field theory, and there's a wonderful, when it comes to generating new pictures to make sense of reality. I highly recommend this YouTube channel. It's called Science Click English. I don't understand the title, but it's wonderful. I mean, if 3 blue, 1 brown is kind of world class, college or early college math, visualizations and explanations, I would say, Science Click English is kind of world class physics. They recently just finished outputting a fantastic series on the math of general relativity. Anyway, fantastic content, 10 out of 10. Super recommended. And they have this fantastic video about quantum field theory that explains it in a very, very visual way about like how, each of the fields that underlie reality upon which, all different types of particles get implemented find their substrate, you could say. They're all, in a sense, implied by fundamental symmetries. Basically, the frame invariance properties of spacetime and relativity only allows certain mathematical objects to actually be able to implement a field that allows those invariances to be maintained. So, the fact that we have, the Higgs field and the electric field, magnetic field, and so on, strong force, weak force, all of these, like, is not arbitrary. That is actually entailed by symmetry, is entailed by this, fundamental geometric preservation of the structure of reality. And that is like so incredibly crazy that before you knew that, physics seems so arbitrary, like 12 particles of matter or like 24, depending on how you count. And, they have these like very strange interactions with one another. It seems like the description of the Standard Model is very, very information dense. It's kind of, where did that come from? But when you look at it through the lens of symmetries in fields, it actually falls out of the math. That's like one of the only few ways in which it could possibly be, if these symmetries were to be preserved. Now, there are some constants, some specific constants such as, the rest mass of the electron and things like that you cannot derive from these symmetries. And that is bizarre. That does seem to be kind of information out of nowhere. But at least a huge chunk of what seemed arbitrary in physics kind of collapses into this very, very simple explanation, which is, yes, this is how reality has to be if it is to preserve, relativistic symmetries, which are, in a sense, something that, is logically entailed. I mean, in that sense, the rationalist, Descartes, trying to think the universe out of, his mind without necessarily investigating it empirically, a super, Descartes might be able to actually go all the way to quantum field theory, but perhaps, not know which constants actually implement these universe in particular. That's the sort of thing that this sort of reasoning makes you realize. So basically in this frame, the various possible spins correspond to the various symmetry groups that preserve the appropriate symmetries of spacetime. And but it goes even deeper. I mean, this is, in a sense, talking about the fields, but also just how the fields evolve according to quantum mechanics. And here's, Richard Feynman comes again. Like if you look at basically the path integral formulation of quantum mechanics, I highly recommend watching Feynman's quantum electrodynamics series on YouTube or reading, his lectures on physics. It's wonderful explanations that when it comes down to it, the reason why light travels through the shortest path through these like geometric geodesics is not that light is kind of omniscient and can anticipate where it is going to be. It's very bizarre, right? Like, how can light know what is going to be the shortest path? And the explanation is that actually light goes through every possible path at once, as well as like electrons and every particle. They go through every possible path at once, constrained by the ways in which you have been probing it, constrained by boundary conditions imposed by how you're measuring it, where it started, where it ended, what kind of constraint, is there one slit or double slit and things like that. Like those would be the boundary conditions, but keeping those certain, quote unquote, everything else is as uninformative as possible. It's almost like nature is doing everything it can possibly do in order to avoid generating information. It's like every time you probe like other pieces in the chessboard, nature says, oh, and by the way, all of the other possibilities remain a live option. And in fact, if you want to calculate probabilities of where to find particular particles, you have to literally consider every possible configuration, superimpose it, then doing this weird thing, which is, squaring the amplitude of the resulting wave, and that gives you the probability of finding the particular particle in a given place. Super weird, quote unquote, the wave function, quote unquote, collapses. That itself, by the way, would generate information. And is one of the reasons why David Pearce actually thinks that, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, where, literally there's the wave function that is a probabilistic kind of position of particles, and when you measure it, it collapses, that is really an illusion of something even deeper happening that does preserve, information, and it also preserves the symmetries of reality. You don't get these everything out of nowhere, information out of nowhere, and that is the decoherence program. I guess like more commonly known as, the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics and the multiverse theory. All of the possibilities happen. And that kind of sounds implausible, but then again, why on earth are like particles apparently doing every possible movement they could? I mean, like when you look at how, quantum mechanics is formalized here, is not only, like all the possible paths of an electron, is also all the ways the electron could have interacted, even with itself, and how it can interacted with, particles that pop out of existence, out of, the quantum vacuum, where you have like a, an electron and a positron, pop out of nowhere, and that also interacts with the electron, and so on and so forth. Every possibility, So it's almost kind of when you're looking at this from a certain point of view, you could say that, well, actually, all of the possibilities always happen. These boundary conditions that we're talking about, that are basically defining the things that you do know, those are kind of pinches in the wave function that basically make it so that kind of the stream goes in both directions, so to speak. So you have basically this decoherence process, but that in reality, there's no pinches. At the very biggest scale, there's no boundary condition. The boundary conditions are local. I mean, like when this electron is doing every possible path, well, in that one path where, maybe it, interacted with a positron that came out of nowhere and, together with an electron and so on, in that path, there's going to be, boundary conditions that from its point of view, however the rest of reality is going to look like. But that in the aggregate, in totality, there is no boundary condition. So this picture of reality is crazy. I mean, now you're talking about how the fact that there's no constraint at all, that, there's nothing, no information that is saying this is here, but nothing else is here because this is already here. It's basically constraining, the exclusionary principle. Because there's none of that, then all of the possibilities become realized. Yeah, and this is, again, kind of the language of implication that is probably worth considering. And yeah, I mean, this is like well known in physics. I mean, I'm not making this up. There's like a lot of like, highly cited articles. Like, for example, like I believe one is titled, "Nothing Ever Happens in the in the Everett multiverse." Max Tegmark has talked about this, how there's certain ways of factoring the Schrödinger equation and the universal wave function that make it so that basically nothing is happening. There's just nothing is happening But, from certain cuts, some ways of, refactoring that nothingness, there's a lot of extremely intricate happenings. But that in the end, in the final analysis, they kind of, in some sense, cancel each other out. They lead to these fully unconstrained fundamental state. And what is that? Well, that might be the nothing we've been looking for. The nothing we've been looking for is that fully unconstrained superposition of all possibilities, has no information. Okay, so that's great. That's in physics. Now let's move on to phenomenology, which is something that, you kind of have to verify for yourself. But, and here's a bit of a plug for if you're interested in donating to QRI, you can get some of these stickers. But, I'm a fan of, the concept behind the logo, which is understanding the entire state space of consciousness, all possibilities of experience. And one of the things that you see here is what's called the CLab color space, which is basically a Euclidean rendition of all of the possible phenomenal colors. And you will see that it's a circle, is not a line. Basically, the reason is that magenta here will connect, blue and red, or purple and red. And, there's kind of this illusory thing that if you see a rainbow, it actually doesn't have the color magenta. But if you were to add, the color, the light frequencies at the top and at the bottom, you will see magenta, which is not in there, meaning that, of course, the experience of color is not experiencing directly frequencies of light, is actually its own state space. And its geometry is not a line with a, lower bound and an upper bound. It's a circle. Actually, it's a 3D Euclidean space if you consider brightness and dimness as well, and like black and white, essentially. But broadly speaking, it connects. And if you take the right combination of psychedelic drugs, you will see lots of rainbows in your visual field. And sometimes they will kind of cancel out. You may have kind of these energized feeling of empty space that then kind of creates a rainbow, and you see all of the colors around it, and then it may collapse again. I mean, this happens on a sufficient dose of LSD. People report these. And as I'll talk about a little bit more in a second, 5-MeO DMT may produce this in quite a reliable way. But essentially, what I'm getting at here is that the phenomenal color, in some sense, can be mathematically described in terms of a symmetry group, which in this case would be, 3D Euclidean symmetry group, or representation of that symmetry group. And that geometry is, in some sense, what entails the fact that all of the phenomenal colors added simultaneously are equivalent with this weird thing that is pure consciousness or formless consciousness. And, we don't know exactly what the geometric shape of different state spaces look like. Besides color, there's like some notion for sound, there's some notion for tactile sensations, but it's not super well understood. But the idea would be that, every qualia variety, color, senses, audio, etc., they all, in a sense, will correspond to particular symmetry groups, and they all, from a certain point of view, can be made to cancel each other out. So, excuse me for a second. So, phenomenologically, at least with color, but potentially with many other modalities, you have these very weird zero ontology property too, that all of the possible qualia values cancel each other out into pure consciousness, which has no information. And I do want to, point out that it's kind of fascinating that, jhanas, for example, these like advanced concentration states in meditation, they are often described in terms of extremely low amounts of information as well. basically the more you purify your samskaras, your basically karma, your impressions and contractions of awareness, you're kind of like slowly ironing out the spatial field of your experience. And if you do that enough, you can get a field that is basically so smooth that energy and information doesn't dissipate. So you can basically put in a lot of information in it without like the imperfections making it, the information transfer to basically dissipate energy. And it can basically work as a kind of resonance box that you add more and more and more energy, and all of a sudden you get these, phase transitions into other states of consciousness that are, their building blocks are in a sense much more smooth and symmetrical. And, if you continue doing that process and, purifying and ironing out in higher and higher dimensions of experience, eventually you get to these like 8th jhana, 9th jhana. I mean, already the 7th jhana described as nothingness, the experience of nothingness, which people is very, very strange. And it, in some sense, maybe it's more related to actually what we care about here, which is finding a correct picture for understanding nothing. Well, the 7th jhana might be a good lead in here. Nothingness, it contains close to no information, and there's like very little to report about it other than it felt very restful, very peaceful, it felt nice, but it's not because it felt actively so, but it had like some kind of transcendent bliss quality to it that is very hard to put into words. And then the 8th jhana, it's even stranger, which is the experience of neither something nor nothing, where you're not even reifying nothing. And basically some people even describe a 9th jhana, which is completely transcendent and not even that, does any justice to it in any way whatsoever. But the point is that kind of there seems to be this convergence point, towards samadhi and quote unquote nirvana, where there's just no information there, just completely no information. So in consciousness too, this nothingness seems to be very important, very, very, very important to understand the entire state space. I think I described this in another video, but briefly, I mean, if you actually want to organize the state space of consciousness, that nothingness point, that center of the spinning worlds, so to speak, is the best place to start. And in a sense, because of the hyperbolic geometric structure of the state space of consciousness, which I don't have time to go into why it's hyperbolic, but basically it entails that the closest path between any two arbitrary experiences, let's say you right now versus a lizard that is drunk and on DMT at the same time, like a pretty exotic, different species, different states and so on. Maybe a schizophrenic lizard even, whatever, like a very different, state of consciousness. The closest path between you and that in terms of like edit distance, like little alterations you could do to it to go from one to the other, is going to get really close, very close to basically the zero state, the zero information state. Basically, there's kind of this huge seeming detour. It's actually not a detour because it's a straight line in that space, but it's going to get really close to the 0 point. So basically, if you want to understand the middle point between any experience, understanding this kind of transcended zero information state is quintessential, is very, very important. It's one of the perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle for state space exploration. Now, up to this, I would say this is kind of a Zero Ontology by David Pearce, and other people explore this explanation space. There's also A Universe from Nothing by Krauser, I believe, and obviously Buddhism and Shenzhen Yang, and even people like Leo Gura. A lot of people in this space who have access to a lot of exotic states of consciousness and think deeply about these tend to kind of like point towards this general notion of there's something really significant about nothing, and nothing is not what you thought it was to begin with. That there is like a post-theoretical or post-experiential nothing that is very significant. But the step that I want to take and kind of hopefully contribute to this conversation, besides, just explaining it, which obviously it's helpful to the conversation, but it's that I think this is very amenable to the empirical method. And I mean, David Pearce emphasizes the empirical method here more in physics. I mean, he says if any deviation whatsoever is ever found of the unitary dynamic of the evolution of the universal wave function, that would rule out zero ontology. Like, it would entail that there's actually generation of information. But as of now, zero ontology seems to hold up, in physics across the board. Well, except that's, sneaky thing about there being matter versus antimatter. But, that's not yet a proof. We still have to figure that out. But there's no like empirical direct violation of any of the implications of zero ontology. And that is trippy. So trippy. I don't know. I was going to say trippy as hell, but it's also trippy as heaven. I mean, it's trippy as everything. it's as trippy as everything, literally. Okay. So, but the empirical method that I suggest is phenomenological. I mean, first with the neural correlates of consciousness, and then eventually mapping it out towards the, fundamental fields of quantum mechanics. But I do think that if we, generate in a super Shulgin academy, so to speak, with a lot of like top physicists, people like Feynman and like very advanced philosophers, and, mathematicians and artists as well for complicated reasons, and computer scientists, but, a concentrated effort to standardize these high energy, super low information states, which, by the way, are also very blissful and potentially very helpful for mental health and and improving, our sense of well-being. Anyway, there's a lot of reasons why to do these, but even if you were just concerned with the question of why there's something rather than nothing, which, by the way, it is kind of a trivia. I mean, it's a fun, fascinating question, but right now there's suffering going on, so it's not the priority. But okay, even if you were only concerned with that and you were like a super billionaire, I would recommend, get a massive team of 1,000, physicists and mathematicians and computer scientists and philosophers, and get them to standardize this zero ontology state with something like 5-MeO DMT and Janus, and look at it from every point of view. Even further, try to measure, for example, the geometry of the electromagnetic field when you're experiencing this zero ontology state. Like, that's the sort of thing that is a no-brainer once you think very deeply about this, especially if you experience these states and recognize their profound significance. Roughly my claim here, and one of the reasons why I'm both assign a lot of credence to both zero ontology and the symmetry theory of valence, is that a lot of these bizarre kind of like equivalences between an energized pure consciousness and the full spectrum of every qualia modality, that happens a lot in something like a 5-MeO DMT state. You can, flicker between rainbow world, so to speak, all of the colors in this prismatic, crazy way, and then kind of look at it from a certain size and certain side, and you get a kind of like pushing the light back into the prism, so to speak, so all of the colors converge and you get white. I mean, the metaphor has its limits, but that's like roughly what it feels like. You kind of twist the prism of reality somehow that enables all of these, multiplicity of sensation and diversified, distinctions of experience to reconverge into pure nothingness or, pure awareness. And we can standardize that and study it. I expect that we will do a lot of progress in, these fundamental questions in philosophy and in physics, because at this point we will be able to even perhaps, analyze the fundamental symmetries of quantum fields in the terms of the kind of operations that can happen, very close to this zero space. And of course, the 0 point, the, zero ontological, zero information state of consciousness, it's so important that naturally, any physicist who stumbles upon it and is serious about figuring out consciousness and its, physical equivalence and whatnot, I think that's just going to stand out as it's an obviously, first shelling point or like low-hanging fruit to look into. I guess I want to maybe conclude, with kind of a little bit of a discussion about like, God. God, I mean, God the creator, in a sense, is kind of an attempt at answering these why is there something rather than nothing. Is also a way of trying to have persistent meaning, which is sometimes a losing battle. But in a sense, that's the type of explanatory style that says reality started at a certain point because something happened, this transcendent, quote unquote, outside time, outside space being. But of course, if thoughts and desires and so on are constructed in sequence, then of course there's a sense in which that of course had time for it to create the Big Bang. So, that explanation space may not really work out, but, God as perhaps not a active kind of entity with personal attributes, but rather as an impersonal ultimate principle for why we exist. I think the zero ontological state is perhaps a very good approximation of, as good as it gets when it comes to understanding what God is. And, there's kind of a lot of, you can get into the weeds here because there's some distinction between, let's say, token identity versus type identity. In token identity, each instance of a certain mathematical object is going to be a different entity, whereas in type, they're all the same. And there's a very trippy perspective that is that maybe, this zero information state of consciousness in some sense is the one and the same, no matter how it is, quote unquote, generated. That is not so much that, when you enter that state, you're generating it and creating a new copy of the zero information state. It's more that you're doing something peculiar to kind of the topology of your fields that make it point towards the 0 point. And any other experience that has ever done that is going to be pointing to the same, fundamental, universal, zero ontological state. Which personally freaks me out to some extent because it makes me feel that, next time I stumbled upon that experience again, is going to be, completely underdetermined who I become afterwards. It's also underdetermined who I was before. There's a symmetry there. But somehow, with my evolutionary programming and my self models, it freaks out my, my kind of naive ego because it's like, oh gosh, then I will, become, people and animals that I may not want to become, a pig in a factory farm, just to throw out a possibility, Then again, once you do experience something like a zero ontological state of consciousness, you're kind of forced to come into to peace with that notion that in some sense is just really bizarre. For example, like why you find where you are right now. How did you get in there? What did you do to get in there? And I bet that you have no idea. You may remember kind of like what you did yesterday that led you to be where you are here. But why you as a consciousness, why do you find yourself entangled in any way whatsoever with that particular timeline? And I think in some sense, the answer might be that, well, actually you're in every timeline at once. You are this one universal electron that is moving backwards and forwards in time in patterns of self-interference. And in that sense, you may not have any option but to be the entirety of everything. One experience at a time, but you're still everything. So it's almost perhaps like exposure therapy. If you experience this zero ontology, zero information state of consciousness more often, in some sense, it may allow your animal self, so to speak, to come to terms with kind of the, universality of consciousness or something like that. Or I don't know, maybe I don't know if it's like that. I do think it's very promising when it comes to like coordination technology. And when it comes to, basically having a really, really strong base on like why we should all be in team consciousness rather than like tribe, create tribes and think like, oh, I am this tribe, you're that tribe, only one can exist. Really how we should be thinking about this is hey, how do we create the ideal conditions in this planet such that the states of consciousness that exist in the future are as, beneficial, as positive, as smart, as self-aware as possible. And like that sort of thing, yeah, this zero ontology state of consciousness can give you a lot of motivation to do. And in that sense, yeah, might be extremely beneficial. Maybe might even get us out of trouble in the future in terms of preventing human conflict. I don't know. It's a hope, and I think there's an interesting case to be made. I guess I'll mention a few last things. One is, the Library of Babel might be kind of a good metaphor. The problem is that in the Library of Babel, and this is a David Pearce idea, you take one book and it has, like nonsense written in it, a random kind of nonsense, a very specific type of nonsense. It only appears once, that particular string of letters. But in a sense, if you, add it back, the entirety of the, structure has a lot of information in some sense. But what David Pearce might say is that a quantum Library of Babel could have just no information, that actually starts out as this basically unconstrained state. And sure, if you take out a book, so to speak, you add a boundary condition, it constrains the possible paths. In that moment, it looks like there's information there. But in its totality, there really isn't. It's actually the superposition of everything. Another thing is David Pearce also mentions that black holes, but right now it's an important thing to figure out, because they may hold a bit of a key clue in here, especially because some physicists worry that black holes destroy information. And there's some theorems about like how information is still preserved at the surface of the black hole, and so on. But yeah, basically, if black holes were to actually destroy information, that would be against the zero ontology. So that's an important thing to figure out. And I guess I'll conclude with this funny phrase, which is, in epistemology, it's true that, you want your theories to basically explain specific things, because if you have a theory that explains a lot, it kind of has a lot of variables. It can explain why whatever you presented would happen. In some sense, that theory is very likely to just overfit. So there's kind of this phrase to kind of make this intuitive, which is a theory that explains everything explains nothing. And David Pearce would say, exactly. To explain everything, you need to explain nothing. And I think if we focus our energies and we create better mediums of thought to think about this nothing, we may, as a consequence, explain it all. This has been a wonderful time, and thank you for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful day. See you next time.